Hi, Dave. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Hi, Ursula. Thanks for having me. Me too.
I think about airline teams and airline experiences. They have actually always been quite static, fragmented, very much transactional focus, and really driven or limited by the legacy technology behind. And this also meant what I have seen so much when working within the airlines where we had challenging environments, we needed to be innovative, and we had a lot of great ideas. And we were often blocked actually by being able to really change something, to control something. It would have taken a long time to get a vendor actually to make changes. So we couldn't really be agile. And if you look at this competitive environment, which airlines are in, a lot of commercial pressure and also increasing customer demands every single day means by dynamic behavior and continuous improvement is so critical to remain viable. If you then add the figures behind where actually there are some forecasts that the value opportunity for modern airline retailing is like $45 billion. And IATA says that by 2026, we are in 25 now, 50% of member airlines will already have implemented more dynamic capabilities. How do you see this, Dave, when everyone talks about modern retailing? How does dynamic retailing fit in here? And what does it mean for you?
Well, I guess dynamic retailing, in one sense, I view as a toolbox for airlines. So, on the one hand, it's a toolbox to allow them to make their interactions with customers through their online channels much more relevant and personalized. And then on the other hand, it's a toolbox that helps them achieve better business outcomes for themselves. And very often those two things are very closely intertwined, but not necessarily always the case. And I might touch on that a little bit later in this conversation. So the toolbox includes integrated capabilities to target customers through simple or even sophisticated rules and algorithms, to run experiments across all touchpoints, and to be able to influence any aspect of the customer experience.
I love the toolbox idea. It also suggests it's very simple. You know what to use the tool for and how to approach it. Do you have some use cases about this? What could this mean in concrete terms?
Maybe just to touch on your point there, I think it is very important that a toolbox can be simple or can be made to be simplified, but can also be powerful in the hands of the right user, right airline user. In terms of use cases, I think there's many possible use cases for an airline customer. For example, maybe a traveler on a business trip, but not necessarily traveling in business class. It might mean optimizing the experience so that the booking flow is really simplified for them. And as part of that, it could mean different aspects. For example, removing those product offers that really aren't relevant to someone booking in their context. Or on the other hand, it might actually mean introducing new parts of the experience, maybe nudges in a particular point of the checkout process to remind them that they do have the option to buy certain products or services that might be relevant for them. For the airline, in terms of a use case, one example might be an airline who wants to introduce a new way of making payments. It could be anything from a new form of payment to a completely new integration with another payment provider. And for them to actually do this in a safe and targeted way. So on the one hand, we might want to limit the ability to roll out this option to certain markets. Each market has, when considering payments, each market has their own complexities. So it might take too long to actually do this market by market if you consider an airline who is taking payments across 10, 15, or many, many more markets. So in terms of dynamic retailing, it's useful to augment this market-based approach with experimentation. So it allows the airline to really safely test the introduction of this new way of making payments, in addition to testing a broad range of markets at the same time.
I always like to compare to the kind of physical situation we know when really comparing it to the shop that you would go to. And as a shop assistant, you would have all of the control and the possibilities to adjust on the situation. You might have a store in a neighborhood where you know there are a lot of very environmental conscious people. You might actually promote more, even in your shopping window already, more of those conscious products that support this. You could easily just change it anyway if there was a big football match being one and you want to adjust actually your whole offerings around this. What could it mean to celebrate? You suddenly want to have the champagne in the shopping window. You want to adjust a bit the promotions that you've got around this and how you offer them even in your shelves when you enter the store. And really also react to realizing actually the customer you saw yesterday, today has maybe another priority because there might be visitors coming. Could this be reflected in the digital world? Is this ultimately, this means experimentation. If you see the shopping window works perfectly, you get many more people entering actually your shop on the day. So you have a chance to really offer them more and then tailor more offers to them. Is that possible actually to be replicated?
It is possible with the right toolbox. So just a couple of important points for me around experimentation. So the first is it really can be used, if designed correctly, to influence any part of the digital experience. Anything from product and offer construction, dynamic pricing, deciding how to lay out components on a particular screen, how to sequence the screens that you have in a booking and checkout experience. Not all tools can support this, but the right kind of toolbox can. And so that opens up a huge amount of potential, but also it opens up a lot of risk, particularly for those airlines who are driving a lot of traffic and a high share of booking volume through their online channel. So in these situations, it's really critical not just to be able to understand and leverage the benefits of experimentation, but do it in the right way. Now, is it really necessary to have to experiment? I think two considerations on that. The first is that the airline commercial market is extremely dynamic. So customer behavior changes every day or every weekday. The market conditions for an airline can fluctuate significantly with geopolitical events or the changing behaviors of the competition, etc. And so when the underlying context of selling and servicing is changing so much, it means an airline needs to be able to react accordingly. The second reason, like I mentioned before, is for those airlines who really rely on the digital channel for a high share of their booking revenue. Without experimentation, if you want to deploy new features, then if you deploy it in the wrong way, that can be have a really negative effect to airlines' revenue. So the safe introduction through experimentation of new capabilities is crucial.
And once you realize actually what you can do with these capabilities by just changing a button, you might get half a percentage point more revenue by adjusting maybe even in a dynamic way your a product banner and being able to generate much more awareness for your new maybe flagship product or offering, and you increase sales with it. The scale can actually be enormous. So probably once you realize it, you realize you actually have to do it, because if you want to remain relevant, but also really use every revenue opportunity and ultimately also create a better experience, if the uptake is higher, it normally means there is already an inherent demand and you simply miss it because you haven't created the right experience for it. But it needs to be really easy for an airline. How would you suggest to approach it? If I look at our TripLake digital commerce platform, where you can actually have a lot of control as a team member in the airline, and you can already change a lot. Is that already a good start? And is it intuitive, or how many barriers are there? How long does it take to do that right?
I think it's crucial to have an approach where you almost experiment with experimentation. There's a lot of different considerations into making sure that an end-to-end experiment works well and can be interpreted in the right way. So it's best not to start with the most complicated use case. And yeah, look, absolutely, there are a lot of really quick wins that I think can be achieved in fine-tuning even small parts of a digital experience. Like you mentioned, tweaking the color of a button, so on and so forth. And those experiments, the downside of maybe getting it wrong in terms of your hypothesis will therefore have less of an effect on your customers. And through this kind of experimentation with your experiments, you should be able to progressively get much more familiar with the tools and the key metrics that you're trying to measure, etc.
And would you also say, if I just knowing how difficult can sometimes be to get started, but somehow it's already even an experiment to say there are a number of really new type of personas that are represented in today's world versus maybe kind of 5 different personas max in the past. If I just take this eco-conscious traveler, you could suddenly experiment by what would be the right offering for them. Would they really actually appreciate it and go and buy? That in itself is probably already a start just to do this. And there are a lot of other, like there are the digital savvy versus there are so many other kind of typical personas now that you could already start the experiment with. Would you agree with this? Because it means the proposition would be personalized in the context of the persona.
Exactly. And this is what I find quite interesting about a lot of the off-the-shelf experimentation tools that are out there in the market, which might provide really, really sophisticated tools to set up and run an experiment. But when it comes to being able to contextualize and personalize an airline flow, for example, targeting a particular segment, targeting a leisure traveler or an eco-conscious traveler, or just targeting a particular set of markets, doing so requires a lot of understanding of all the different data attributes that are relevant to an itinerary or a user session, etc. And some of those tools are limited in that respect. So what we can do with TripleAke, for example, is allow an airline in this toolbox to set up these contexts or personas, so it immediately already targets the impact of the change you're trying to make to a specific use case, and not to everybody. And then on top of that, to actually experiment with that context to see if it performs above.
Yeah, and ultimately still not only more flights, but also more ancillary services, so tailored services. Do you think that in the future experimentation could run completely on its own with AI? Is that actually an option?
Oh, fully. And so I mentioned certain off-the-shelf experimentation tools in previously, and many of these tools actually provide the ability to make their decisioning based on reinforcement-based learning models. Without going too much into the detail, what it means is they can help airlines or any retailer execute an experiment and more safely shift traffic to the winning variant over the course of the experiment based on the performance that it is monitoring. So that's the reinforcement learning model aspect. Now, those tools, like I mentioned before, those models can be interesting, but they're not enough. They're not enough if you're not able to actually contextualize the experience as well. So what we're doing with TripleAke is to actually provide airlines with the ability to do both, not only to leverage machine learning models, use reinforcement learning to make sure that experiments run in the most optimal way, but do it in a really highly targeted fashion. So only the relevant parts of the experience are being experimented with.
And could this ultimately mean, so there would be also self-learning elements, so it would even be more tailored because it could be recognized what your preferences were before. Maybe your seat preference might not change, even if you have different purposes of travel, or you might always like extra comfort and book a lounge in addition. Could that become a reality soon?
So the issue with using a more traditional approach to setting up and running your experiments is if you're first targeting through static rules, so you're trying to understand who you want to target and then run your experiment based on that. With machine learning models, you don't necessarily have to do that pre-targeting. The model will figure out the optimal experience to show to users. And that experience could be whatever you happen to be experimenting with. So changing the color of a button, changing the layout of a screen, or the ordering of your screens.
Could that eventually mean if you go and do a booking versus I go and do a booking and any other person, it could almost be a one-to-one experience, because it could really reach the scale with machine learning, which with manual experiments couldn't really be done. Could that become a reality?
Exactly, but the point is even further than that. It's to make sure that your one-to-one experience is relevant for this moment today when you're interacting with the solution.
Yeah.
And not some preconceived notion about who you might be. So I think that's the real power behind this.
Yeah, that's ultimately what we are aiming for with Lake, this journey to achieve this true personalized approach. It also means it's really an elevated experience, and it will create not only additional revenue, but really high customer retention, because you will simply return to the airline. If this works seamlessly, you will actually prefer this over any other possibility and option. And would you agree that with the statement that actually it means almost to do this up to that level, machine learning is essential, but it will take a while to set it up because it needs enough data sources to really become completely meaningful?
Depends on how you define essential. I think to someone who is crawling, then I think it's essential that they learn to walk before they can run, right? And there's a lot of gains to be made in just trying to do that. Trying to go from crawling all the way to sprinting might mean you end up not ever able to be the best possible sprinter. It takes time to be able to gain maturity in any kind of process. And experimentation is certainly a process where it takes time to really become an effective user. So I think, going back to the point about the toolbox, the key thing is to have a toolbox which allows that journey from crawling to walking to sprinting to really occur and be the best possible tool in the hands of the user, whatever the level of maturity happens to be.
The motivation, if you measure it right, is there immediately, because you can really see the revenue gains, which can achieve enormous numbers, even if it's only less than half a percentage point improvement, obviously dependent on the size of your airline. So if I think about some of the limitations within airline teams, there might not always be enough resources. There might be not even enough customer insight yet, not yet enough customer thinking. There might maybe be lots of systems limitations in place today. I would probably argue you can still already do something. You can still actually experiment with what you can control and just make some adjustments. Make maybe also a hypothesis about some of your market segments, and do in the simplest case, a proper review of your digital capabilities and where could you really start, and also of your data capabilities, to at least get the already some additional mindset into this direction, whilst you might eventually decide you want to enhance your technical ecosystem. Would you see it in a similar way?
I do. I think what I've observed is quite often the case with airlines is to embark on a program where you're experimenting with different parts of the solution. It often competes with a roadmap that the digital team is trying to achieve, right? Activate this feature, integrate with that third party, etc. It's very often the case, these other roadmap items, at least in the minds of the digital team or the airline CFO, they have much more, let's say, predictable ROI. So, activate a new insurance partner, you can make some assumptions around insurance sales, etc. And notwithstanding, there's a huge amount of data out there about the potential for experimentation to improve, for example, conversion or attachment rate. It's often seen to be less predictable, more of a risk. And that's so it takes a little bit of a backseat. But I think if an airline can craft out in its mindset and with its finance department's mindset where they can start small and progressively start to actually observe the ROI from making small changes. And that's probably a good way to build up confidence, measurable confidence in terms of the opportunity. And there are loads of case studies and references to, specifically with airlines, about the types of changes that, for example, with the booking flow, that might drive significant improvements to the likes of conversion. So one thing we tried to do with the Branchspace customer success team is really provide the framework with which to think through these different ideas and possibilities with experimentation, and actually walk an airline through the process from conceptualization all the way through to running and measuring and concluding an experiment.
Yeah, and it's true. And we've even seen that this is sometimes the starting point, even before thinking you don't have the right environment yet in place. You might need to adapt it to just say, where can we get started? That's where also our consulting team has already been quite helpful to really set this up and to realize what you can do even within your limitations. And it gives the confidence, I think it's right what you mentioned, to really move ahead further, because suddenly you can make your business case for even any investment that you might be looking at. And you also realize that the traditional, even customer insight that you need for this customer changes all the time. It might be the same person, but dependent on the reasons to travel, with whom the person travels, and so on, there might be different preferences, and you cannot capture all of this unless you experiment, unless you start with a good basis of what you know, and have the courage. I think it's probably above all the courage as well to just get started.
I agree.
And for sure, that's a good thing where we can also help customers next to sharing more with what Trip Lake can do as well to facilitate this. Super exciting times. Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Ursula.